The silence in the office space was unnerving, the kind that wasn't calm, but expectant, like the air itself was holding its breath. I locked the door behind me and jammed a chair under the handle. It wouldn't hold against a real push, but it might buy me a few seconds. Seconds were gold now. The office was large, but eerily open. Glass partitions divided cubicles, and overturned desks cluttered the space. Outside, the faint orange glow of the city illuminated the room enough to navigate, but the distant groans from the streets below reminded me that I wasn't safe. I gripped the fire axe tighter, its handle slick with blood. My hands were trembling. The window drew me in. A sniper's instinct, maybe. Even with no ammo, I needed to see the battlefield. I crouched low, moving toward the edge of the room. Below, Times Square stretched out like a forgotten graveyard. Hundreds, no, thousands of zombies shuffled aimlessly, some dragging themselves along the blood-slicked pavement. Others clawed at the lower windows of the building, their fingers leaving streaks on the glass. I didn't get long to sit. The chair wedged under the door creaked, the faint sound of something pressing against it. The groans grew louder, accompanied by the rhythmic thump of hands hitting glass. They'd found me. The door shook violently, the chair scraping against the floor as the undead outside began to force their way in. I bolted upright, surveying the room for options. The desks, the cabinets, even a few toppled bookshelves. This was a battlefield waiting to happen. I grabbed a filing cabinet and dragged it across the floor, the sound grating against my ears as I shoved it toward the door. Another hit, harder this time. The door buckled slightly, the groans louder now. No way out. The first one burst through. A woman, half her face gone, blood smeared down the front of her torn blouse. Her jaw hung slack as she lunged, fingers clawing at the air. I swung the axe in a wide arc. The blade sank into her skull with a wet crack, and she collapsed against the doorframe, twitching. More followed. They came in bursts, forcing their way through the broken doorway. A man in a business suit, his ribs exposed, lunged at me. I brought the axe down on his shoulder, severing the arm entirely. He fell forward, and I had to shove him back with my foot before delivering a final blow to his head. The air was thick with the stench of rot and blood. Each swing of the axe sent sprays of gore across the walls, the desks, my face. They kept coming, their relentless moans blending into a chorus of death. One grabbed my arm, its nails biting into my skin. I spun, slamming the axe into its neck. The blade didn't go all the way through, leaving its head dangling grotesquely as it stumbled forward. I kicked it back, the force tearing the head free with a sickening rip. My arms burned with every swing, and the axe felt heavier with each kill. The bodies were piling up, making it harder to maneuver. Blood pooled beneath my boots, slick and warm, threatening to trip me with every step. The room finally fell silent, save for my ragged breathing and the drip of blood from the axe blade. I leaned against the desk, my hands trembling, my muscles screaming for rest. The barricade had collapsed entirely, the doorway now choked with bodies. For now, they'd stopped, but I knew better than to think it was over. I began searching the room, hoping for anything useful. The desk drawers were mostly empty, pens, papers, things that didn't matter anymore. But in one drawer I found a flashlight battery, small but functional. I replaced the dead one in my flashlight, and flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness like a knife, revealing the carnage I'd created. In another corner, I found a set of keys and a half-empty water bottle. My throat burned with thirst, but I forced myself to sip slowly. I pocketed the keys. Who knew what they might open? A quiet crackle caught my attention. A radio. I dug through the drawers until I found it, old and dusty, but intact. The signal was weak, static, cutting in and out. I adjusted the dial, straining to hear. A voice broke through, faint and garbled. Evacuate. Uptown. Coordinates. The signal cut off. I slammed the radio against the desk, but it was no use. Whatever message it had was gone. But the word evacuate hung heavy in my mind. There was something out there, someone still alive. The groans started again, faint but growing. The ones outside were moving again, their hands slapping against the lower windows. I knew I couldn't stay. The barricade was no longer an option, so I turned to the far side of the room, where a maintenance door stood ajar. The map I'd grabbed earlier flashed in my mind. It showed that the maintenance shaft led downward. The stairwell wasn't safe, but maybe the sub-basement was. I opened the door and stepped inside. The shaft was narrow, steep, and smelled of mildew and rot. I shined the flashlight down. It seemed to stretch forever. Behind me, the groans grew louder, the sound of bodies shuffling against glass and wood. There was no time. I gripped the fire axe tightly and began my descent into the darkness, the faint sounds of the undead following me like whispers. The last thing I heard before I closed the maintenance door was the crash of glass. They were inside. The building was theirs now. And the sub-basement. That was still a mystery waiting to be revealed. For now, I moved forward. For now, I was alive. The groans had started again, faint at first, like a whisper through the concrete walls, then louder, more insistent, as if the entire building itself was breathing. I stood in the maintenance hallway, my fingers slick on the fire extinguisher I'd found. My Beretta sat holstered on my hip, empty and useless. The utility knife was my only fallback now, and I could already feel the crusted blood caking the hilt. The hallway ahead stretched long and narrow, dimly lit by a single fluorescent bulb that buzzed and flickered like a dying insect. Cubicle walls lined both sides, but I could hear them. Slow, deliberate movements. The zombies were here. Not many, but enough to make my chest tighten. I inched forward, my boots crunching on broken glass. I froze at the sound of movement to my left. A head appeared, jerking unnaturally over the edge of a cubicle wall. Milky eyes locked onto mine. It let out a low, guttural moan and lunged. The first one came fast, crashing into the cubicle wall as its decayed fingers reached for me. I swung the fire extinguisher with everything I had, the metal canister connecting with its temple in a wet crunch. It staggered back, black ichor leaking from its shattered skull, but it didn't stop. God damn it, I hissed, swinging again. The second hit took it down, its head collapsing inward with a sound like wet cardboard. The body fell, twitching once before it stilled. The groans grew louder. They were coming. From the far end of the hall, shapes began to emerge. Slowly at first, then faster. as more shuffled into view, a dozen, maybe more. Their clothes were in tatters, their skin pale and stretched over sharp bone. One of them, a woman in a blood-soaked dress, dragged a trail of viscera behind her like some grotesque wedding train. I backed up quickly, keeping my eyes on the horde. My foot caught on a fallen desk lamp, and I stumbled. The groans turned to snarls as they surged forward, their movements disjointed but purposeful. I pressed my back against the cubicle wall and fumbled with the fire extinguisher. The first zombie reached me, its teeth snapping inches from my face. I pressed the nozzle and sprayed, a jet of freezing mist engulfing its face. It recoiled, clawing at its eyes. Using the distraction, I slashed at its neck with the knife. The blade wasn't sharp enough to decapitate, but it tore through sinew and cartilage, leaving its head dangling grotesquely. I kicked it back into the others, buying a precious second. I moved, ducking between cubicles as I sprayed more mist into the horde. The fog gave me cover, confusing their already sluggish senses. I could hear their groans turn frantic, their movements erratic as they stumbled through the cloud. One came too close, its bloated hand grabbing my arm. I twisted violently, bringing the knife up and driving it into its chin. The blade pushed through with a sickening pop, black ichor spilling onto my hand. I yanked the knife free, the body collapsing in a heap. The hallway became a battleground of blood and viscera. The fire extinguisher became my weapon of choice, its blunt weight cracking skulls and shattering teeth. Each hit sent a spray of black and red across the walls, the fluorescent light flickering to cast it in grotesque detail. One zombie, its jaw unhinged and swinging loose, charged blindly through the fog. I sidestepped and swung hard, the canister connecting with its head and sending it spinning into a desk. It twitched once, then went still. The blood was everywhere now. My boots slipped on the slick floor as I backed toward the far end of the hall. The groans were quieter, but not gone. The ones still standing were crawling now, their legs broken, their hands clawing desperately at the ground. I stood panting, the fire extinguisher heavy in my hands. The hallway was silent again, save for the faint drip of blood pooling beneath the bodies. The air was thick with the stench of rot and copper, making my stomach churn. I wiped the knife on my sleeve, the fabric already stained beyond repair. My arms ached and my hands trembled, but I couldn't stop moving. They'd heard the noise. Others would come. I reached the end of the hallway, where a heavy metal door stood slightly ajar. Through the crack, I could see a larger office space with sturdy windows overlooking the city. It was quiet, too quiet, but I didn't have a choice. I stepped through, locking the door behind me. Whatever was in here, it was safer than what was behind me. For now, the city outside was worse than I remembered. Times Square, once bathed in neon light, was now dark and filled with shapes, too many to count. Some were trying to climb into the building. Others just stood, swaying in the darkness. I leaned against the wall, gripping the knife tightly. The groans were faint now, but they wouldn't stay that way. Not for long. The groans came from below, wet and guttural, like wind forced through a rotting pipe. I could hear them clawing at the jagged edges of the floor breach, their broken nails scraping against the concrete. I stayed low, pistol in hand, counting the ammunition I already knew I didn't have enough of. The air was thick with dust, and the sour tang of blood sticking to the back of my throat like glue. I stared down at them through the hole. Some were still tangled in the rubble, their limbs bent in directions no living thing could survive. And yet they moved. One, a woman with half her face gone, her jaw hanging by a sinew, dragged herself free and tilted her head up toward me. Her eyes were cloudy, like spoiled milk, but there was hunger there, primal and unrelenting. She reached upward, fingers grasping for nothing. I raised the Beretta and fired. The shot rang out, deafening in the confined space. Her head snapped back, splattering dark, coagulated matter across the rubble below. But her hand twitched one last time before it fell limp. The others didn't flinch. They didn't look at the fresh corpse beside them. They just kept climbing. I moved away from the breach, my boots crunching on shattered glass. The office floor was a mess, desks overturned, monitors shattered, a trail of smeared blood leading to the corner where someone had tried and failed to barricade themselves. Their body was gone, but the red streaks told the story. Whatever had dragged them away hadn't been kind. The stairwell was ahead. I crouched near the door, listening. The groans below were louder now, rising in volume as more of them gathered beneath me. The idea of opening that door and descending into whatever waited there made my stomach churn, but staying here wasn't an option. The ones above were still coming, and I didn't want to be here when they arrived. I gripped the door handle and turned it slowly, the creak of the hinges loud enough to make me wince. Inside, the stairwell was a concrete tomb, dimly lit by an emergency light that flickered just enough to be infuriating. I edged forward, Beretta aimed at the shadows, but I didn't have to wait long. The first one came into view, shambling up the stairs, its body draped in tattered office clothes soaked in gore. A chunk of its throat was missing, a blackened hole that oozed something viscous. It didn't moan. It didn't growl. It just moved, dragging one foot behind it as it climbed. I waited until its head was in clear view and squeezed the trigger. The bullet punched through its temple, spraying the wall with chunks of bone and brain. It collapsed backward, hitting the stairs with a sickening thud, but it didn't fall alone. 2 more followed, then 5, then a dozen. Their movements were slow but relentless, like a tide that didn't know how to ebb. They filled the stairwell, pressing against one another, their hands reaching, their eyes fixed on me. I didn't have enough bullets. I fired again, then again, but every shot just seemed to wake up the rest of the horde. They climbed over the bodies of the fallen, their hands slick with gore, their mouths gnashing hungrily. The noise was unbearable. Groans, gunshots, the slap of flesh against concrete. I stepped back into the hallway and slammed the door shut. My breathing was ragged, my hands shaking as I slid a nearby filing cabinet in front of the door. It wouldn't hold for long, but I needed time. That's when I heard the crash, the breach. I turned just in time to see one of them, a man in a shredded business suit, crawl through the jagged hole in the floor. His lower body was missing, intestines trailing behind him like grotesque streamers, but he moved with terrifying speed. His fingers clawed into the carpet, pulling himself forward with inhuman determination. I didn't think. I reacted. The first bullet hit his shoulder, but it didn't slow him. The second struck his forehead, and his skull exploded in a spray of black and red. More followed. 2, then 3, then 5. They poured through the breach like rats fleeing a sinking ship, the air filled with their rancid stench, a nauseating mix of decay and rot. I backed into a corner, firing until the Beretta clicked empty. My hands scrambled for the knife I'd found earlier, and as the first one lunged at me, I drove it upward into its jaw. The blade pierced through its skull, and it collapsed against me, dead weight pinning me to the wall. Another grabbed my arm, its teeth snapping inches from my face. I yanked the knife free and slashed wildly, the blade cutting through flesh and sinew. Its head lolled to the side, barely hanging on, but it kept moving until I slammed the knife into its eye socket. The gore was everywhere. It soaked my clothes, my hands, my face. The smell was overwhelming, and the sound of their bones crunching under my boots as I fought to keep them at bay was worse. I didn't have a plan anymore. Survival was the only thought left in my mind. By the time the last one fell, my arms were shaking, the knife slick with blood. The hallway was a slaughterhouse, the floor slick with viscera, and the bodies piled so high I could barely see the carpet. My breath came in ragged gasps, my vision blurred from exhaustion. For now, the Horde was silent, but I knew it wouldn't last. I turned toward the far end of the hallway, where a maintenance door stood slightly ajar. It was my only option. Behind me, the barricade on the stairwell groaned under pressure. They were coming. I gripped the knife tighter and stepped forward, leaving the carnage behind me.